All right, well, wonderful to see everyone today out in force. My name is Will Hedberg. I am the director of the Asia Center at ASU, and it is my great honor to introduce our distinguished speaker, Professor Tina Liu of Yale University. This is an event we've been looking forward to for a long, long time. I'm going to start by thanking all of you, thanking my co-sponsor at the Humanities Institute, Ron Broglio, who unfortunately is sick today and can't be with us. Thanking our colleagues and students who have helped with arrangements and logistics and support, especially Chan Lin, Victoria Day, and Lindsay Weedy. And most of all, thanking Professor Liu on behalf of the Asia Center and the HI, especially for braving Arizona in the bright, early beginning, opening, barely tip of the iceberg days of our now 11-month summer. We lured Professor Liu here last fall with laughably false promises of mild and fair March weather, and nature responded by reminding us all of who's really in charge. And kind of to linger one more moment, as Arizonans are wont to do on the weather, the bracingly fresh temperatures of recent days serve as one more reminder that we are living in an era of transition, of change and challenge and hardship, to be sure, but also of great possibility, imagination, and dare I say it, even potential and hope. In thinking about the crucial place and impact of the humanities in addressing the challenges of our moment, and in thinking about how best to reimagine, redefine, and explain the importance of the work we do to new audiences, I can think of no better role model than Professor Liu, whose prolific scholarship is encyclopedic in range, virtuosic in methodology, and suffused with a sense of curiosity, contagious pleasure, and humanness that engenders epiphanies and welcomes readers of all backgrounds into the community. Professor Liu is the Colonel John Trumbull Professor of East Asian Languages and Civilizations at Yale University and served as a president of the Modern Language Association from 2025 to 2026. She is a scholar of late imperial Chinese literature and global humanities who has published on a truly dazzling array of topics ranging from genealogies of family and emotion to optics, telescopes, and the history of lenses in early modern East Asia, to vernacularity in media studies, to digital approaches to the study of woodblock prints, to representations of slavery, money, and human trafficking in late imperial Chinese fiction. She is the author of numerous monographs, translations, edited volumes, and research articles, including Persons, Roles, and Minds, Identity in Peony Pavilion and Peach Blossom Fan, Accidental Incest, Filial Cannibalism, and Other Peculiar Encounters in Late Imperial Literature, and Approaches to Teaching the Story of the Stone. As the president of MLA from 2025 to 2026, Professor Liu provided guidance and support for humanists of all backgrounds and disciplines through a tumultuous period of uncertainty and disruption. Many people in the audience were in the audience at the recent conference in Toronto, the theme for which chosen by Professor Liu was family resemblances. In one of her columns for the MLA, Professor Liu describes family by saying each of us is a conglomeration of teachings passed down by teachers, teachings that we ourselves have the privilege of passing down. That's the true family. The family reunion is more important than ever. And I will simply close by saying it's a great honor and pleasure to welcome Professor Liu back to the ASU family, and we look forward to listening and sharing.
Thank you so much. Thank you all so much for coming, and thank you especially to Professor Hedberg and to Chan for arranging all the details. And if you were at the Toronto convention, a lot of this is going to be a lot of the same talk, but a real chance for us to gather together and talk together and to plan and to organize. I'm going to be using the first person plural, we, a lot, meaning the MLA, but really it can be any range of institutions. The AHA if you're a historian, the AAS if you're an Asian studies scholar, but honestly, the people that you knock on doors with, the people that you serve hot meals with, the people who are your community. And the central theme is going to be something that I believe in with all my heart, which is the importance of organizing and of allying with people with shared interests, not just to increase your leverage for a specific issue, though that is true too, but to build community and identity and a sense of belonging. I also am going to apologize in advance because I think a lot of what I have to say is really pretty obvious. I'm here to facilitate a conversation because where we are now is going to need brainstorming and organizing and community and consensus. So Let me begin with the Trump administration. I'm sorry, I always slip and call it the organization because that's actually kind of what it is. The Trump administration has understood higher ed as a kind of enemy of the state, and maybe particularly the humanities. So within that world, we have withstood repeated assaults. I'm a superstitious person. I hate writing this list because it just gets longer and longer, and I start to blame myself for making it happen. Let's add a war in which our weapons that we pay for, are now killing children. So here's my list for now. Domestically, one end goal has been to silence dissent. And higher education is obviously a big target because we are a place where dissent is structured, where civil disagreement takes place and out of which we incrementally learn, and we learn from one another. Now, as offensive as all of these things are, I'm not actually going to be talking about them today. They give clarity to our current moment, but in some ways, they don't really change that much because focusing on the last few months gives us an out. It gives us a misplaced belief that once this period is over, what follows will inevitably return us to where we were, or at least be an improvement over the current moment. And honestly, I'm not sure I believe that. I'm going to talk about where we are and where we're going. By we, I mean the MLA, but I really mean all of us. I mean humanists who would like to make a living doing this work, but also teachers and students. I am a deracinated child of immigrants. I'm an academic nomad. And more than anything else, this family of teachers and students has been my home on earth. So, a short history of the MLA. The MLA is what I know best, but the history I'm going to tell is actually one that has been replicated across multiple organizations and institutions. So, the MLA was founded in 1883 and conceived of in contrast to classical studies by a group of scholars who were mostly philologists who admired how the 19th century German Academy had gathered together and reinvented scholarly work in many fields, transforming belles lettres and antiquarian curiosity into what we now call research. And these are our ancestral institutions with their departments and their parallel work. And in the first centuries of the 20th century, it is the MLA that actually helped create English literature as its own discipline. What were the ideas behind it? That English could be serious, that literary history was as important as philology. So the MLA's membership did not consist of the English professoriate. It was really one of the main means by which the English professoriate coalesced and was invented. But the modern history begins after World War II, when American higher education expanded dramatically in scale, especially with the GI Bill and with Cold War investments in education. So in 1950, the U.S. had 2.3 million undergraduates. In 1970, that number had quadrupled. And state governments and the federal government invested hugely in research as part of Cold War national policy. And many of the state campuses, not ASU, which is older, but many were built or planned at this time. And it was at this moment in the 1950s, and this is important, that the MLA transformed itself from a scholarly organization to a professional guild. And our forms as an institution, and you can think of everything, the handbook, the job listing, support for the profession, they have everything to do with this history. And in fact, centering the guild on tenured and tenure track faculty made sense because this is a period of radical expansion. Now, in some ways, the MLA did make this growth possible. Some of you, not very many of you, might be old enough to remember the interviews and the time when those interviews dominated the convention. Raise your hand if someone has asked you, what do people do at the MLA now that there are no interviews there? I get asked that all the time. But it isn't just in the convention that we continue to pay a price for this particular history. The MLA was deeply imbricated not just with American higher education as a whole, but also with an earlier version of the job market, which hasn't existed, as far as I can tell, since the early 1990s. We framed parts of our institution according to a mistaken assumption that a state of affairs that had no historical precedent whatsoever, eternal growth, would hold for time evermore. And, as we know, it didn't. So I'm going to pause this history at the convention held at the end of 1968, which is one of the years of peak MLA membership and also one of the most tumultuous moments, both in American history and in MLA history. So there's so many ways in which 1968 continues to reside deeply in Americans as embodied history. So the convention that year was held in a hotel that is now the Sheraton, New York Times Square. And I can't resist this little tidbit that 6 months earlier, Paul McCartney and John Lennon held a joint press conference there. In those days, the convention met in the days immediately following Christmas. And on Boxing Day, December 26th, about 450 people met at Columbia in a meeting, a pre-meeting. They were pre-gaming, the New University Conference. And I'm going to refer to this as the NUC. And this group, which consisted of faculty and graduate students, was later reconstituted at the MLA as the Radical Caucus. And at the conference the next day, the NUC put up handmade posters. And that is why the hotel had 3 members of the MLA arrested. So John Hurt Fisher, the executive secretary of the council, the old name for the executive director, had actually been working and negotiating with the NUC for many days by this point. And he and all the MLA officers were really lobbying the hotel to make promises that charges would be dropped. The hotel refused. And throughout Friday and Saturday, both informal meetings and formal panels at this convention were just jam-packed. People were meeting in the hallways. And finally, on Sunday, the business meeting, whose role really had been a pro forma approval of the budget, was attended by somewhere around 800 members and lasted over 6 hours. 6 hours of literature professors talking, you guys. You know, just imagine. So a lot happened at this meeting. So one of the first things is that Louis Kampf, a professor of literature at MIT, was elected second vice president, and he basically won by a landslide over the candidate that the executive council had chosen. Also, a decision was made to avoid holding next year's convention in Chicago. So you guys will recall that in 1968, the Democratic Party had held a convention in Chicago, and it had been the scene of terrible police brutality. Also, a number of resolutions were passed, one having to do with the MLA itself, asking the Executive Council to appoint a commission on the status of women in the profession. This photo is of that very moment when that resolution was passed. But many of the other resolutions were political. A declaration of opposition to the war in Vietnam, a declaration opposing the punishment of student protesters by withholding their financial aid, a declaration of opposition to the draft, and finally declaring support for writers oppressed by authoritarian governments. Now, I've read through a bunch of these documents, which happen to be on JSTOR, so it's actually a pleasure and easy to read them. And 3 things are really striking to me. The first is that the MLA has really continued this particular conversation for more than 5 decades now. Members continue to articulate arguments about whether literary studies and language teachers have political obligations and what those obligations consist of. There are many ways in which this ideological battle remains unresolved. The second is that this was a revolution from within. The NUC had really studied the bylaws, and they'd figured out how to install their preferred candidate as president. And the final thing is that despite how heated things got, and there was even some concern about violence, there do not seem to have been threats of resignation from the MLA, or at least not very widespread. So the modern MLA, the one that we all know, really emerged in the wake of this convention. And it really changed in response. So those spontaneous gatherings in the hallways of the Sheraton turned into, pardon me, the Americana, turned into formal caucuses. And in their current topics, we can see all the things that really became absolutely central concerns of the MLA. But that change was also reflected in the MLA's governance. An earlier version of the MLA could not have conceived of officers who looked like me. And honestly, that's the tip of the iceberg compared to the MLA governance as a whole, which is truly the most diverse group I've ever been fortunate enough to be part of. I don't really know other opportunities for scholars and teachers from institutions all over the country, from publics and privates, community colleges and R1s, to learn from one another and also to make hard decisions together. Nonetheless, there are ways in which tensions from that moment have continued to fester, and not just the degree to which political engagement is our responsibility, but also the degree to which our governance represents our membership and what a truly representative participation in the MLA would entail. In reading these documents on JSTOR, I'm actually deeply moved by the sincerity of almost everyone involved. So on the one hand, we have Fisher bemoaning that 300 reformers were able to control a convention of 11,000 because they knew to attend the business meeting. And he writes of modifying the Constitution and bylaws, and he promises that he's going to publish in the PMLA all new business so that people will know what to expect when they get to the business meeting. And on the other hand, we have Kampf, who I think Fisher would have called part of the insurgency. And he describes the business meeting as exciting, interesting, fun, vigorous. But his intervention is also one of governance, with hopes for necessary structures to open up the MLA. So for both of them, they're really interested in changing the representative structure. Now, some version of this conflict continues to live with us, still unresolved. Everybody wants the MLA to be more representative. We continue to be more afraid of and more desirous of representation than ever. So I should give you the background for this. So like much of higher ed, the MLA was riven by debate over Palestine-Gaza in the wake of October 7th, 2023. I am delighted to explain to people what happened insofar as I know. If you want to ask me at Q&A, I know some people may not be as interested in the blow-by-blow as others, but in short, the central conflicts: how to separate anti-Semitism from anti-Zionism, how to avoid being torn in two by genuinely principled disagreement, how in this moment to sustain a center when the forces that tear away are so powerful. These have plagued everyone in higher ed, pretty much. Okay, so much for continuities. Just as strikingly, despite the superficial resemblance, the MLA of 1968 and the MLA of 2026 are fundamentally different. Amazingly enough, NUC leaders thought that the state depended upon us. Louis Kampf speaks about how American higher ed's objective is to produce workers for capitalism. His colleague in the NUC explicitly connects the liberal arts to the arts of war. Lauder and Kampf are both fresh from a reading of Gramsci. They understand the professoriate as being what Gramsci called al potere, what translators into English have rendered as in power. I don't think it's a great translation. It's a better translation into Chinese, which is 在朝. were at court. So intellectuals have been rendered into administrators for state power, this critique goes. They are turned into people who curry favor with the government and regard their main task as effectuating government's priorities. And all they are doing is translating coercion into some slightly less coercive form of consensus. Now, if there was a moment when this might have been true, 1968 was probably it. This is probably the moment at which our collective voice was powerful enough so that anything we said would not simply be a collective speech act. But this is where we are now. So, this is a pretty depressing picture. Almost 60 years out, it is really hard to conceive of how non-marginal these professional organizations and really higher ed as a whole were. So MLA membership has had two peaks, once in 1968 and once in 1990. Really, because of population changes in North America, the real peak was around 1968. So relative to the population of North America, MLA membership now is about a third of what it was in 1970. So imagine a membership that is 3 times bigger than the MLA now. It would be a membership of somewhere north of 60,000. And most of those people, if we're going to indulge in this imaginative act, most of those people would be either lifetime employees of institutions or people who could pretty much presume that they would be lifetime employees. So this is the moment precisely when dozens of institutions were either being founded or radically expanded, and each of these was hiring dozens, sometimes many, many dozens of faculty in humanistic fields. Again, many of them tenured positions. Or you could look at it another way, looking at the convention. In 1968, attendance at the convention was 11,750. Adjusted to the current North American population, that would make for a convention of over 20,000. Instead, the convention this year had a participation of about 1/6 of that. So something that has shrunk by more than 80% is arguably no longer just a smaller version of itself, but maybe something else entirely. Now that crude version of the NUC's critique, that academics are in bed with the state, never, ever fit us as well as it did the sciences and the social sciences. Yes, some of us did benefit from federal support of foreign language study, but I think it's true to say that government support of our research was often an afterthought. And in so many ways, the idea that we were part of the state is never really who we were. Still, for decades, there was a kind of homeostasis, of the kind that the sociologist David Laborie writes of in 2017. Laborie argues that that U.S. higher education was able to balance the popular, mass education, the practical, education in relatively useful subjects, like accounting, and the elite, being internationally respected as high quality and scholarly. To Laborie, the chaos of our contradictory market-driven system would protect all of us. That because supporting higher ed was in the long-term interests of states, states would in turn continue to support higher ed by supporting its labor, by continuing to hire these lifelong positions. Guys, that didn't happen. State budgets have largely not kept pace with inflation, but I think we can also look back at Laborie's work and feel that this Whiggish history is a kind of mockery of like an actual ecosystem. It was great for the lions, but maybe not for the antelopes. But also, by the time Laborie wrote this, the balance was already well on its way to collapse in ways that are really now truly apparent. So I know that there are a handful of you, because there always are, and these are good questions, who are thinking, that's your own fault. And the you might be the MLA, it might be the humanities, it might be the academy itself. That if you had done this, if you had done that, you wouldn't have lost members. So I will point out that this kind of bleeding of membership has characterized all of our sibling professional organizations, no matter what their discipline, including the social sciences. And moreover, here is what the Bureau of Labor Statistics says about our professions as a whole. So this is just the last 8 years. The endpoint predates the second Trump administration. 23.9% and 30.9% declines. These statistics are not of tenured or tenure-track faculty members. This is everyone who has full-time employment. In other words, the MLA and the AHA, et cetera, have actually held on to members better than the profession has held on to people. So let me tell you where our profession stands now as I see it. The big picture is that the post-World War II higher education complex has already kind of come to an end, at least for the humanities. And it actually took place a few years ago. So these are the kinds of things that grab attention. So basically when tenure is threatened, you'll see headlines everywhere. But the real impact is this. When the labor of instruction has been transferred to those workers whose labor is less protected. Basically the adjunctification of American higher education. The financial crisis of 2008 was a coup de grace. It was a moment of crisis that institutions took advantage of on a grand scale by moving to contingent labor. And those things that David Laborie identified as strengths, the fact that higher ed as a whole in the U.S. is administered separately by thousands of different decision makers, what we learned is that those were norms. And we are living in an age when the fragility of norms is all too apparent. Now, all of this has been very well documented. I assume that none of it is that much of a surprise to you. But I think that here is the upshot. We cannot count on universities. When push came to shove, we were shoved, and we have been shoved, and we will continue to be shoved. And here's the takeaway as far as the MLA itself is concerned. For a very long time, we've thought of ourselves as a professional guild. But you cannot be a guild when your profession ceases to exist, at least in a way that we have shaped ourselves around. So to draw on Gramsci again, I would argue that we are all in opposition now. We are all intellettuali organici now. So in talking about the current state of our profession and the MLA, nautical metaphors are rife. You know, the arranging deck chairs on the Titanic, that ship or another ship sailing away, that ship has sailed. I want to deploy another one. That ship was never us. We came along for the ride. We produced teachers at all levels. We made that ship work. But there was nothing foreordained about the convergence between our work and the modern institutions of universities, even though for many of us it has afforded lives of joy and meaning. It's only one ship, a single vehicle among many others. To phrase it in medial terms, the academy was always the medium. It was never the content. And a lot of our work has always existed uncomfortably within its margins. So with thanks to some friends and allies, yes, we did do our best. And yes, we had many victories within that framework. Yes, our training did allow some of our students to become outstanding shipbuilders and run ship factories and to succeed at that world and to shape it. And sometimes other shipbuilders recognized our world. But I think we all know that part of our teaching always involved a critique of the game itself, inculcating a sense of self and mission that might have included that mission, but often rose above. And now we're in the middle of an untethering between ourselves and these institutions who are in some sense in free fall. Our history shows us that we haven't always been a guild, and indeed our mission is not centered around it. So here's the MLA mission in its own words, a sweeping mission, nothing less than a description of our disciplines and our work. And I'm sure that the other professional organizations have their own missions that are defenses of the way that we see the world. So I feel like I've been in so many wonderful conversations in my few days here. And one thing that has come up repeatedly is that this particular mission speaks to human needs that are going to be around for as long as people gather in groups to talk and share with one another. Our mission is actually core to what makes us human beings. When I teach my students, when I talk to people in the public, when I interact with alumni, I am always struck by how many people seem to intuit what study after study shows. That reading on paper sinks in more deeply than reading on a screen. That talking in person with other people makes things real. That our brains respond totally different to reading a book as opposed to reading a plot summary. That every layer of mediation between us and other people and texts just stands in the way of learning. What we do feeds something so deep and profound and human that we never need fear that people are going to stop wanting it. And as we untether ourselves from the model of the guild, we also get a chance to ask ourselves, what are we really? As I see it, we have a bunch of shared values, and here they are. The first is listening. Every single one of us, whether we teach language or teach literature or study language or study literature, we are in the business of listening to others and of helping others also to listen. The second is that we are part of a long, long chain. We believe in cultural continuity, and we are part of it. We like what we appreciate handing things down, and we appreciate what we have had handed down to us. And the third, which is connected to the first two, is the capacity to imagine better worlds than the one we're in. We have always borne witness for those whom the world hasn't worked. And now, an interlude of Chinese studies. Okay, sorry about that, guys. You just at some point, it always turns into Chinese studies. Or enough telling, here's some showing. So last semester, I had the joyful experience of teaching a first-year seminar in which over the course of a semester, we read a 120-chapter novel in translation. That novel, Story of the Stone, sometimes also known as Dream of the Red Chamber, is the story of an aristocratic family's decline, an account of how a group of adolescents grow up together, and also the mythic tale of how a stone used in the creation of the universe is reincarnated as a human boy. And I'm now going to turn to two tiny episodes in this big novel, two tiny episodes that are open to and welcome our outpouring of interpretive energy, which I feel like is also kind of core to what we are. So in chapter 97, one of our teenage heroines, Lin Daiyu, is on her deathbed, and her grandmother comes to visit her. And Daiyu gasps out, I'm not going to try the gasping, but I'll just say, "Grandmother, you have loved me in vain." So on the one hand, Lin Daiyu means that her grandmother should not be abandoned by her descendants because they have predeceased her and cannot be filial to her. And in that sense, her grandmother's care for her has been in vain. If your descendants are meant to care for you, there's no point in caring for them if they die before you. A dozen years ago, when I taught this at Peking University, the entire class insisted on the interpretation that I'm just giving you. But one could understand in vain very differently. Daiyu's final illness was precipitated by her learning that her grandmother has actually arranged for Shui Baocai to marry Daiyu's beloved Jia Baoyu instead of her. So now Dai is dying of love sickness, and what Dai says can also be understood as an angry reproach. So behind the first interpretation, an apology to her grandmother, is another, in which these same words are now a reprimand. Grandmother, you who have always claimed especially to cherish me have in the end betrayed me. So your love was nothing real. If you had truly loved me, Dai is saying, you would have made the match for me that you know would have allowed me to continue living. Now, my Beida students, who were products of hermeneutically controlled educational settings, really resisted this interpretation because they knew that it kind of falls into the category of the unspeakable. There are very few moments in pre-modern Chinese literature where children or grandchildren chastise their parents and get away with it. Now, at first pass, Grandmother Jia understands what Dai says exactly as my students at Beida did, as a socially acceptable apology that she cannot care for her grandmother. So Grandmother Jia says she was very distressed and she said, "Oh, my dear, don't worry, just take care of yourself." But then, and this is the quote here, but then after thinking a bit, she leaves the room, she thinks a little bit, and then she comes up with another interpretation. And this time, she's kind of PO'd. Her defensive response proves that she fully understands that Dai had just rebuked her. So Grandmother Jia here proposes a third meaning. She argues that it wasn't the case that her love was unreliable, but instead misplaced on a girl who, in this reading of "You Have Loved Me in Vain," has confessed to a forbidden and shameful liaison. So Dai has pulled off the trick of saying two mutually exclusive things at once, and then she and Grandmother Jia have even more strikingly managed to have an entire conversation about the unspeakable in words that surround it but don't say it. Now, to me, to my students this semester, some of whom had never before read a long novel in its entirety, those long ago unspeakables came across loud and clear. You know, words written 250 years ago in another language, in another world, read powerfully to my students and me. This novel is filled with diegetic poetry, and its characters, many of its characters rather, lead lives that are immersed in all the joys of pre-modern Chinese high culture, whose greatest pleasures are linguistic and poetic. But at the end, Dai, the novel's most accomplished poet, burns all of her poems and bitterly speaks to her grandmother in the simplest and most straightforward vernacular Chinese, perfectly legible even now to someone who might only have studied a few months of Chinese. This isn't the only way that the novel calls to mind Mikhail Bakhtin when he describes the heteroglossic logic of long fiction itself. And I want to actually now turn to the way that the novel not only stages a kind of conversation between poetry and prose, but also between owners and slaves, and the way in which that is at the heart of how the novel both celebrates Chinese literature and indicts it. So the novel's characters are split between cosseted aristocrats and the people they own, enslaved servant girls. And these enslaved servant girls are just as important as the owners to the novel's plot. They are just as beautiful, they are just as smart, and we see this world through their eyes as well. So about 20 chapters before Dai's death, a slave girl dies an even lonelier death. So I am calling Qingwen here Skybright, which is Hawkes' translation. And both characters in the novel and commentators on the novel note that Skybright and Dai look like each other. And they're like each other in other ways, too. Each one is beautiful. Skybright is recognized as the prettiest of Baoyu's slaves, and neither one hides the sharpness of her wit. Each one has her enemies. Both are disliked by Baoyu's mother, especially. And of course, the doubled nature of them. The fact that Dai has a double who is a slave forces you to be wondering to yourself. These are questions that remained silenced for the most part until the 20th century, but I think they're still just there. Whose life is worse? Why are some people born slaves while other people are born to own them? How can we understand a world that is grounded in such injustice? So Baoyu's mother kicks the dying Skybright out of the household, and she's forced to seek refuge with a cousin and his wife who barely tolerate her. And Baoyu sneaks out to go visit her, and he's horrified by how squalid her surroundings are. She is lying on a reed mat. She begs him to give her some tea, and he cannot even recognize this filthy beverage as tea when he pours it. And she's full of regrets that her beauty led people to misconstrue her behavior, that she never sought out Baoyu's favor. In fact, they have a close platonic friendship. And then their conversation is interrupted by her cousin's wife, who ends the scene by grotesquely attempting to sexually assault Baoyu. He runs away. She dies the next day. Baoyu is devastated by her death, and he interrogates two little slave girls for a report. Both of them are hearsay reports because the only person around was an older slave woman. And the first girl says this: Skybright had her neck stretched out all night, and then in the morning she closed her eyes and stopped speaking, dead to the world, unable to make a sound. Those were her last breaths. Baoyu said hurriedly, "Who was she calling out for all night?" The little maid said, "She was calling for her mother." Wiping his tears, Baoyu said, "And who else?" The little maid said, "I didn't hear her calling for anyone else." Baoyu said, "Silly, you must not have heard right." The other maid sees where this is going and quickly interjects a made-up story in which she herself had been the last one to see Skybright, whose last words are that she is not dying. She is ascending into the heavens and has been designated a flower goddess. When Baoyu wants to know what flower is she goddess of, the second little maid catches a glimpse of the flowers currently in bloom in the yard and says, "Hibiscus." Which account is real? A girl dying alone, calling for the mother who sold her as chattel in early childhood? Or the version that emerges out of the aestheticized world of the novel, of literature itself, that tells Baoyu exactly what he wants to hear? Baoyu is so delighted by the second maid's account that he spends the entire next chapter writing an elaborate classical language elegy for the spirit of the hibiscus. This piece is included in its entirety in the novel, ends up taking far more airtime than any of the versions of Skybright's death, and it consumes Baoyu's emotional energy, transplanting his feelings for the actual girl. Now he gets to adore the hibiscus goddess and not think about the girl calling out for the mother who will never come. So on one hand, the first maid's blunt account of Skybright's death and Baoyu's own visceral encounter with the squalor of Skybright's surroundings, and on the other, all the pirouettes and flourishes of a many centuries-long literary tradition no longer serving truth, but avoiding truth. Now, if you know this novel, you know that it refers repeatedly to a mythic realm where Baoyu himself is a reincarnated stone and his beloved Dayu is a flower goddess. So maybe all such stories, maybe the novel itself, maybe even the whole of literature, are just salves for the unbearable pain of reality. Two deathbed scenes, two dying girls, written in a world that hardly values them, each of them in death seemingly a disavowal of literature itself. And once again, we are enjoined to theorize. Maybe there is no making sense of the world. Maybe there is only bearing witness. Our position is one of weakness that is strength. Those 18th century structures of power are long vanished, replaced by others. But Skybright's death, the questions it poses about literature itself, are still powerfully around, still to be revived whenever we listen and whenever we teach others to do so too. A fictional enslaved girl who died alone has outlived them all. She still makes my students cry. Again, our values, which I am neither in doubt of nor worried for, which I know will endure. We listen, we teach others how to listen, we pass it down, we imagine a better world. Where do we go from here? We are and always have been fighting Gramsci's war of position, of persuasion, of culture, of the long haul. But don't mistake that position for weakness. It is a position of strength and always has been. And don't mistake our having shrunk for not being important anymore. It might not appear like it, but the MLA is more important than ever. Not like a giant boat like Noah's, but a safe house where we gather together that it can expand to house whoever wants to join us. A sociologist of knowledge would note that the MLA's outer forms and those of the university are remarkably conservative. In some ways, everything looks as it has for a long time, even in the little ways. The MLA's big convention, I could talk about the university, but I'll also talk about the MLA. The big convention, the complaints that people are here for socializing and not for the panels, how to be more representative, the feeling that all we need to do is to persuade some dean or another that the skills we teach actually do make students more employable. I have made the argument tonight that things have changed so enormously in the last half century that some of these continuities might better be understood as residual, the way that Raymond Williams defines it, as a way of speaking to their ongoing power. And I want to warn us about this because the residual can entrap its participants. In 1898, in the wake of increasingly naked attempts by colonial powers to carve the Qing Empire into spheres of influence, and also after catastrophic flooding, whose casualties probably numbered in the millions, a group formed, the so-called Boxers, known in Chinese as the Yihequan, and they combined traditional syncretic religious beliefs with calisthenic rituals, and they believed that these would make them invulnerable to bullets. If enough of them entered into a trance at once, they taught that an army of spirits would descend to help them rid China of all the foreigners. With support from the Qing Empire, they declared war on the Western and Japanese powers with disastrous results. Their chants did not make them invulnerable from bullets. The conflict that followed caused enormous human suffering, and they weren't the only such movement, and not even the only movement of that decade. You might be reminded of the ghost dance of the Great Plains of the late 1890s that promised the return of the ancestors and the purging of the Europeans. Or you might be an Africanist who remembers the Maji Maji rebellion of East Africa of 1905, whose leader prophesied a potion that would render its drinkers impervious to bullets and ready to expel the Germans. None of these solved the problem of being pervious to bullets. In all of these cases, an indigenous cosmology that it had elements that are to this day vital, that still respond to human needs, engage with particularly toxic forms of modernity. In none of these cases did people fail because their cause was wrong. Neither moral failure nor bad actors were to blame for the tragic, self-immolative results. Instead, they failed because they drew on residual forms that were no longer aligned to structures of power, not because of an inherent weakness in those forms. So let's not do that with our own residual. Let's steer away from being entrapped by it, even as we draw strength in language to engage with the emergent, with the tensions and challenges of this new world. So I'm going to wrap up very quickly. We're at a moment when we see an end to our guild, but also we see that there is no institution that otherwise represents our shared mission. So I'm really glad that I've done what I could to push the MLA to continue to open up and democratize. I think it is so important to open those doors as wide as we can and to point to them and to say the value of our safe house can be marked by how much it admits dissent. But I've also been doing my best to encourage my fellow teachers and students to use the space of the MLA, to use the institution, the convention, the forms, the residual, to reimagine who we are if we aren't a guild. Who are we if we are people who share a mission and not an employer? How can we think about spaces for critical thinking about language, literature, media in this moment of radical untethering? The forces arrayed before us that regard human minds as nothing but consumers are seemingly infinitely powerful, but I really refuse to concede defeat when we represent deep human hungers. So obviously we need to start thinking our way out of models of education that center 18 to 22-year-olds preparing for a life in the workforce, and to start thinking about learning, study, teaching more expansively. I'm so intrigued by your Mirabella, where my friend David Scoberg's mother lives, but can we think of 1,000 Mirabellas at all different scales for all different kinds of people? And how can it be that most of us cannot afford the Mirabella when we are precisely the people who produce the content that gives it its luster? Many decades ago, when I was a very young, very green assistant professor, a student said to me, quote, "Wow, for someone who is just a Chinese teacher, you have a lot of ideas," unquote. I've been holding this grudge for decades. I am still just a Chinese teacher, whatever that means. I wear that title and the accompanying title of just a Chinese student with more pride than I'll ever wear any other. I am still someone with more ideas than answers, but what I'm asking for of everyone right now, everyone who is just a teacher, who is just a student, let's get together. Let's share our ideas. Let's build things together. Let's imagine our better world into being together. Thank you so much.
Let's open things up for Q&A. I can run the microphone around.
I'm wondering what's your hope for the MLA for the following 100 years?
I don't know, but I really feel this is a time for, as I've said, a kind of reinvention, precisely because if universities survive these few decades ahead of us, they are going to look radically different. I think that the MLA may continue its role as a guild for basically college teachers and those who hope to become college teachers, but I think it will also expand in other ways and will need to. I think I mentioned to you at the graduate student event that, including things like keeping track of undergraduates who majored in languages and literatures and asking them at age 40 whether they would be interested in participating in classes, creating different. I think I said this at the graduate student event to much laughter, which is, in some ways, we have created an institution that provides a certain kind of content precisely for the age group that is most resistant to accepting that kind of content. There's nothing wrong with teaching 18 to 22-year-olds. I love 18 to 22-year-olds. I'm like a total generational trader. Gen Z are my people, whatever. But I also feel like whenever I've had the experience of doing anything with continuing education, I'm always amazed by how much a 40-year-old appreciates a chance to read and talk deeply about a book in a way that an 18-year-old doesn't. Like, you bring more of your life to it, but you also recognize how vanishingly rare and also how transformative that kind of experience can be. So I think, as in this kind of moment of crisis for higher ed, we're going to have to think about all sorts of ways. And again, like, the challenge is going to be to figure out a new model. So I have a friend who was involved in the recent retranslation of Marx's Capital, and he once told me at a cocktail party, he gives capitalism another 500 years. I was like, bro, that's not what I wanted to hear. But he said, you know, like 500 years, plus or minus 30. It was amazingly precise. You know, like, we are going to have to figure out ways for us to fit into this new world. You know, the old model of universities is at a crisis point. So how do we make public humanities provide jobs for us? How do we continue to make an argument across our society of something that people actually intuit, which is there is tremendous joy in thinking about books, learning how to speak new languages, hanging out with other people who are doing the same thing. You know, this is basically like Confucius was doing this, you know, and it's a model that's going to go on for as long as there are people, but we need to figure out how to keep it sustainable and move it forward. Ernesto. No, you did not have a question. Okay.
No, I'm loving all this. It's so interesting. And when you were talking about the model of universities being funded by governments, I immediately thought of the Iowa Writers Workshop, which was the first national creative writing program in the U.S., and it was funded by the CIA. And the idea, and it was funded in the 60s, and the idea was, we'll get writers to then perpetuate the propaganda we want and form these ideologies and whatnot. And I'm like, oh, okay, yeah. So this is the norm, I guess, but also something that collectively we can push against. I think, right? I mean, that's the hope.
I mean, you know, we never got that much. We always getting a relatively small amount of funding from states compared to many of the sciences, you know, the kind of the development, you know, kind of engineering, et cetera. And, you know, and on the other hand, like, think about the things that the Iowa Writers Workshop has produced. And if you were actually a state agency hoping for the production of propaganda, you would say your ROI was like really terrible, right? Like it was like, this is not what you necessarily had in mind. I think we're going, you know, I've got no answers in some ways. I am hoping, I just know for sure that, first of all, that no one can do this individually, that this is the kind of thing where you need people, you need a community, you need to be able to like talk to other people who are interested in public humanities from all over this country at all different ranks and all different levels. And I know that that's something that the MLA can do. And I also know that in some sense I feel not that pessimistic. I do not think we're, like, I'm super pessimistic about many things. Let me just say that. You know, the kind of 500 years plus minus 30 doesn't fill me with joy either. But what I mean is, I think that when I teach my students, I actually feel like I'm not that great a teacher. You love this class because of something that you want. You know, like, you love this class, you became good friends with other kids in this class because it works for you. And I know that that is out there.
Could I follow the pessimistic note or ask you to expand upon it? Some of the people you cited were Adorno, Raymond Williams, Gramsci. Of course, Gramsci writes from
prison.
And the gap between his hopes, his idealism, his structural Marxist critique of the system was not actualized, as it were, or closed. And then, on the other hand, I hadn't realized the history of 1968 and the MLA convention. There you have a unvarnished idealism that managed to change the institution. So the old Leninist question is, what's to be done now? Outside of any possibility of a Leninist or any kind of historical materialist revolution, that's not happening anytime soon. We have our institutions, and we have our daily love of literature and our daily love of thinking and building community. But our community is being squeezed institutionally in all sorts of ways, whether it be workloads or enshittification or you name it. So how to close the gap from the Gramscian 1968 model to the present moment? Or how are you thinking about this?
I mean, the first thing is just like, if you had to put money on Gramsci or Mussolini as someone who is going to continue to like influence and inspire, like, my money's on Gramsci. Gramsci actually won that one in a crazy way, though he ended up, like, his own personal outcome was not the victory. But I also just feel like we are at this moment where I feel like things have changed so fast for my own graduate students. I know that this is true for graduate students who are here, that people who were admitted 5-6 years ago, it's almost like you were admitted under false auspices. Like the world changed around you and made it so that what you thought you were getting, a professional degree, is really, when you look around at the job market, cannot be considered necessarily a professional degree. Somehow we have to square the fact of what these numbers and this political reality shows us, and also the fact that in our day-to-day, many of us feel deep soul-sustaining meaning in the work. We somehow together have to figure out ways for the work to continue and also for us to survive. I have no answers. I only know that can only happen collectively. I think that's obvious, that not just because it is with other people that you find solidarity and community, but also that for most of us, because we are not geniuses like Antonio Gramsci, for most of us, we find meaning and strategy in working with other people. So I think that, like, how are we going to kind of, I should be asking Professor Loser about this, like how are we going to create an environment where the public humanities thrive, when we know that there is a kind of hunger for this in the world? So I don't know, Christopher, but thank you for the question. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you for your lecture or talk. My question would be, what is the biggest success and failure in the last 10 years? Like with MLA, is there any kind of certain moment you find that you made a bad decision or you really made a good decision just in like in 10 years?
I'll tell you for the last 2 years, okay? So the bad, so so many of our institutions of higher learning have been riven over this single question of Palestine, Israel, as you all know. And it has been very hard for the MLA, which is almost the kind of institutional version of the Episcopal Church, you know, like, it's just like, it to basically hold the center. So we had a group of scholars approach asking for a vote on BDS, basically a vote on boycotting scholars from Israel. And the problem was that any vote would represent the organization. And much of the MLA's funding comes from states because it has multiple contracts for the bibliography. And many of those states, most states, including New York State, so blue states too, have laws on their books prohibiting contracts with organizations that support BDS. And so, like, I think the really good thing that we did was we then went through and changed the rules so that a membership could make a vote and it wouldn't represent the organization. You know, that it could be a kind of statement that did not represent the organization wholly. But this is the kind of thing, and I think if I did not follow it closely at ASU. I did follow it very closely at Yale and was part of, you know, like many of my students were demonstrators and hunger fasters, hunger strikers, etc. This is a kind of, this whole set of conflicts really revealed the difficulty of holding a center at this particular moment. And I think that I am really trying to appeal to the value of having an institution that is able to hold within it a lot of people who may disagree with each other on a few issues, but actually still have shared interests and will succeed much better if we continue to hold those differences but actually stay in conversation. So, does that answer your question? Yeah.
I'm a first-year philosophy student, and I am not very well-read in critical theory, so I'm going to make probably quite a few mistakes and stumble through my question. But I found it slightly funny that you put Adorno's associated with critical theory, and in my understanding, it seems like critical theory has at least two of the essential features of critical theory is that you kind of want a unity of theory and action. You're not trying to divide them as the work of a philosopher is theory, and then you can do whatever you want, try to apply it, please. And you also have the idea that even the very concepts that we use are relative to a given historical social moment. And sorry, and that I remember overhearing a conversation between two professors who were visiting ASU, and one of them mentioned a guy named Max Horkheimer. And I do not know how famous he is.
Very.
Okay. Okay, I'm not going to try to stumble over myself tonight. And, one of the things I remember them saying was that, Horkheimer something. The person who, critical theory, what is critical theory? The people who would be doing critical theory you wouldn't know that they are doing critical theory until we're already at the point where we've kind of liberated ourselves. I guess, maybe like a Hegelian way. I don't, actually, never mind, I'm not really sure. And it also, to me, when I heard you say your colleague gave capitalism 500 years plus or minus 30.
He was joking, incidentally.
Okay.
He's like, yeah, he was joking. But what he meant was that when we say like late stage capitalism, like we often leave out the how long does this late stage last? And what comes after it is, like, so he was part of a joke.
Well, I think the bringing into the fold of like academia, because critical theory is, even I've heard of it, even though I don't read anything really in that domain. And it seems like the people who are within the academy claiming to do this critical theory have kind of habituated themselves into, we are just going to go to conferences and talk about these ideas. We're going to say, oh, yeah, well, no, this is how we do it, this is how we do it. But when do you actually free yourselves? When do you unite theory and action? And do you think that the academy has certain limits on what kind of intellectual activity can occur? And if whatever those limits are, it's, to me at least, it seems like a lot of important work would be outside of those bounds. But in what way can that research be done when so much of the work in the humanities, well, I'm familiar with philosophy, seems so technical? And if you're outside of this network of quote unquote intellectuals, then you can't really get your foot in the door. You can't keep up with the discussion. So what do we do? Like, do you have any idea of?
I think these are such good questions. I really kind of want to thank you, because you're right. Like, in some ways, there is a reason that I wasn't citing my research on like Song philosophy. That the research that is rewarded by the academy may not align with what is most persuasive to people, with our teaching, which I do kind of genuinely feel is like a kind of a good, and also where does action take place in this? I mean, I think I'm a really practical person, basically, as I think a lot of you guys are. Like, honestly, in my life, I'm usually just thinking about like, how can I keep my department afloat, for another year? How can I make sure that my grad students find postdocs? How can I try to flip New York 1? Like, and then like I kind of have a little plan that I work out. But I think this question of like how to align our intellectual lives and our action is really a wonderfully sincere and hard one. It is, there's no easy answer to it. That the same work that may get you a job teaching philosophy may not be the work that you feel aligns with your desire to create social good.
well, then what's the point?
Well, I think this is you're at the beginning of this journey, and I think you should be thinking about it pretty consistently for the remainder of your time. Definitely, so the number of philosophy tenure track jobs has diminished somewhat in the last 30 years. Let me just say, in a kind of, without having gone looking at the statistics the way I've looked in my own fields, it may well be that you are going to be thinking about other forms of employment. I would think really hard about what you want to do that for you leaves you as a deeply integrated human being. Because that seems like it is something that is a strong desideratum for you. There are many people who find it fine to do a job for a few hours a day, sometimes many jobs a day, and to have traded their time for rent and food. If you do not feel that way, you will have to put thought into it.
I think with that, we're out of time.
Oh, wow, what a downer.